There are people who move through the world deliberately invisible, who learn, through necessity rather than choice, to keep their eyes down, their sleeves long, their footsteps quiet, who become so skilled at not being seen that eventually even they begin to forget there was a time when someone looked at them like they mattered. Nora Callahan was one of those people. She was 7 months pregnant, working the overnight shift in a stranger's mansion, reaching up to dust a shelf at 2 a.m. when her sleeve slid down her forearm. And the bruises were right there. Dark, deliberate, unmistakable, the kind that come from fingers closing too hard, too many times on someone who had stopped fighting back because fighting back only made it worse. She didn't know anyone had seen them. She didn't know that the man standing 20 feet behind her in that corridor had gone completely still, that he wasn't looking at the bruises first. He was looking at a small scar above her left eyebrow, a scar he had watched happen 17 years ago when they were children on the same block, and she had jumped a fence to get his stolen backpack back and landed face first on the other side. He knew exactly who she was, and she had no idea he recognized her. If this story already has you, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me, because what happens next will stay with you long after it's over. The Brennan estate sat at the end of a private road in a part of the city where wealth had long ago purchased the right to silence. Stone walls, iron gates, a driveway long enough that by the time you reached the front entrance, whatever world you'd come from felt like a different country entirely. Inside, the ceilings were high and the hallways wide, the kind of architecture that had been designed not merely to impress, but to remind anyone who moved through it exactly where they stood in the order of things. Declan Brennan came through the front door at 2:10 in the morning with the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 14 hours doing work that could not be described in polite company. He dropped his keys on the entryway table and stood for a moment in the amber glow of the hallway sconces, pressing one hand to the back of his neck, working out the tension that had settled in over the course of a day that had required, at various points, precision, patience, threat, and the particular kind of composure that left a man feeling hollowed out by midnight. The house was quiet. The marble floors caught the dim light and threw it back in long, dull reflections. Somewhere deep in the building, a clock ticked. The pipes in the old walls hummed faintly with the movement of water. Outside, an October wind worked its way through the hedgerow lining the east garden with a low, steady pressure, pushing against the tall windows like something that wanted in but knew better than to ask directly. He moved through the corridor toward the kitchen. Not because he was hungry, but because the kitchen was the room at this hour that felt most like a normal house. Ordinary sounds, ordinary smells, the small human reassurance of a space designed entirely for things that had nothing to do with power. That was when he saw her. A woman in a plain, dark uniform moved through the far end of the hallway, carrying a caddy of cleaning supplies. She was slight, dark hair pulled back in a low knot, and even from 20 feet away Declan could read the exhaustion in the slope of her shoulders, the specific, deep exhaustion of someone managing ongoing pain and simply refusing to put it down. Her shoes were worn at the heels. The uniform hung loosely on her frame, except at the midsection, where the fabric pulled taut against a pregnancy that was visibly far along. She didn't see him. She reached up to wipe the top of a hallway shelf, and her sleeve slid down her forearm. Declan stopped walking. The bruises were dark and deliberate. 5 distinct points of pressure fading from deep purple to a sickly yellow at the outer edges. The pattern of fingers. The pattern of a hand that had closed around that wrist, not once, but many times, in the particular way that speaks not of a single incident of rage, but of a sustained habit of control. He stared, and then something else caught his attention. Something about her profile in the low amber light. The angle of her jaw, the way she tucked her chin when she concentrated, and above her left eyebrow, a small curved scar, pale against her skin. He knew that scar. He had been standing 3 feet away the day she got it. She was 9 years old, and she had jumped off the chain-link fence behind the Hester Street laundromat trying to retrieve something that had been thrown over, and she had landed face first on the other side and come up with blood running into her eye and told him she was fine before he'd even had time to ask. Nora Callahan. The name surfaced from somewhere so deep it felt like it had been underwater for 17 years. She turned slightly. For one fraction of a second their eyes met. She looked away immediately, picked up the caddy, and moved with quick, deliberate steps toward the service hallway. The walk of someone who had learned that being noticed was the beginning of being hurt. Declan Brennan did not move. He stood in the corridor of his own home and watched the ghost of a girl he hadn't seen in 17 years disappear around the corner. And he did not sleep at all that night. He sat on the edge of his bed with the lights off, turning his phone over in his hands, staring at a wall he couldn't see. The bruises. He kept returning to the bruises, not just their presence, which was damning enough, but their pattern. The dark inner rings where the pressure had been greatest, the yellowed outer edges where older bruising was still fading beneath new. That wasn't one incident. That was a practice. That was someone who had done this enough times that it had become, to them, unremarkable. And she was pregnant. 7 months, he estimated. Maybe less, maybe more. He was no expert, but enough that simply working a night shift on her feet, carrying supplies, reaching and bending and bracing herself against shelves was a cruelty in itself. Enough that whatever she was running from had to be considerably more frightening than the alternative, or she wouldn't be here at 2 in the morning doing this at all. Declan had not built what he'd built by being sentimental. That was not a boast. It was simply the truth of the life he had made. He had come up from Hester Street with nothing worth naming. No father. A mother who worked the fish packing plant on double shifts until her hands cracked and bled, and she came home smelling of brine and exhaustion, and still found ways to love him that he only understood years later. He had fought his way through every rung of a world that rewarded ruthlessness and punished everything softer, until his name carried the kind of weight that didn't need to be explained to anyone in 3 boroughs. He had learned, early and permanently, that emotion was a liability, that showing what you felt was an invitation to someone to use it against you, that the men who lasted in his world were the ones who had learned to feel nothing, or at least to make certain no one could tell the difference. But Nora Callahan had existed before all of that. She was from a time before the money and the fear and the empire and the particular loneliness of being someone that everyone was careful around. She was from a time before anyone in the world treated Declan Brennan like he was worth something to be afraid of. She was from a block, from the fence, from the years when the most powerful person he knew was a thin girl with a too big backpack who stepped in front of people twice her size without appearing to consider whether it was a good idea. By 6 in the morning, he was downstairs. The household was beginning to stir. Kitchen staff arriving through the service entrance. The low industry of breakfast preparation starting behind closed doors. He found Mrs. Keene, his head of household staff, in the service kitchen with a clipboard and the focused expression of a woman who treated domestic logistics with the gravity of military operations. The woman on the overnight crew, he said. Dark hair. Pregnant. Mrs. Keene looked up. That'll be Nora. She's been with us about 3 weeks. Came through the agency. Good worker. Quiet. Keeps her head down, doesn't complain. One of the better ones, honestly. Who put her on nights? She requested them. Said she preferred it. Mrs. Keene studied his face with the careful attention of a decade's worth of reading his moods. Is there a problem? No problem, he said. Move her to days. Light duties only. Nothing requiring lifting, sustained bending, or being on her feet for longer than 30 minutes at a stretch. If she objects, tell her it's policy. Mrs. Keene nodded with the particular gravity of someone who understood that the conversation was not a request. Declan left the kitchen and stood for a moment in the service corridor, his hand resting on the wall. Somewhere in this house, Nora Callahan was sleeping, or trying to. And somewhere not far enough away, someone had put those bruises on her wrists and believed they would go unanswered. He was already deciding otherwise. The East Wing Library was the one room in the Brennan estate that felt like it belonged to a person rather than a reputation. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, actually red. A fireplace that threw warm, uneven light across the Persian rug and the 2 leather chairs angled toward it. Windows looking out over the garden, which in October was all bare branches and iron gray sky. Beautiful in the specific way that things are beautiful when they've given up pretending. Declan had built a great deal of his life around projecting the right impression in the right rooms. This was the room where he didn't bother. He was there the following afternoon, a file open on his knee, when she came in. She moved to the far bookshelves without looking at him, cloth and spray bottle in hand, beginning her work with the focused, mechanical efficiency of someone who had learned to be in a room without occupying it. She braced one hand against the shelf for balance as she reached, the belly making simple things complicated, her jaw tight with the effort of managing it without asking for help. "Nora," he said. She didn't turn around. "Nora Callahan." Her hand stopped moving. She stood perfectly still for a long moment, her back to him, and he watched her breathing change, the rise and fall of her shoulders quickening and then deliberately slowing, a person pulling themselves back under control through sheer will. "It's just Nora," she said. Her voice was quiet and careful. "And I go by a different name now. Sit down. I'm working. Sit down, please." She turned, and he saw her properly for the first time, not the half-glimpsed profile from the hallway the night before, but her face in full in the firelight. She was thinner than he remembered, though his memory was of a child, and she was 31 now, and had clearly lived every one of the years between. The softness of childhood had been replaced by something angular and guarded, the particular sharpness that comes not from hardness but from sustained vigilance, from a face that had spent a long time controlling what it showed. The shadows beneath her eyes were the kind that no amount of sleep would fix. She sat on the edge of the chair across from him, hands folded over her belly, back straight. She didn't lean into the chair. She sat like someone who needed to be able to stand again at a moment's notice. "How long have you known it was me?" she asked. "Since the hallway. Last night. I didn't think you'd recognize me. I recognized the scar." Her hand moved involuntarily to her eyebrow, caught itself, lowered. "You disappeared," he said. 17 years ago. One day you were on the block. The next day, the apartment was empty. My mother moved us to Bridgeport. She had family there. Her voice was flat, careful. "It happened fast. It wasn't planned. You could have found me. We were 15 and 14. We were kids, Declan. I looked for you." Something moved across her face, surprise, or something that had the shape of grief. It was gone almost before it appeared. "You shouldn't have," she said. He leaned forward. "Who put those bruises on your wrists?" She stood up immediately. "I need to finish the shelves." "Nora, it's nothing. I bruise easily. Pregnancy thing." She picked up the spray bottle, turned her back to him. He watched her hands. They were shaking, the bottle trembling in her grip until she pressed it hard against her hip to steady it. He didn't push. Not yet. But the question was in the room now, and it was not going anywhere. If this story is reaching you right now, please subscribe and drop a comment below. Tell me, did you think you would recognize her? I read every single one. Now let's keep going, because the truth she's been carrying is about to come out. Over the days that followed, he paid attention the way he had always paid attention, quietly, from a distance, cataloging without appearing to watch. He observed the way she moved through the house along the edges of rooms, always with her back toward the wall, always aware of every door. The way she flinched when something closed too loudly. The way her eyes went to exits before they went to people. The long sleeves regardless of the temperature. The prepaid phone with the cracked screen that she checked not like someone expecting a message, but like someone monitoring a perimeter. She ate alone, standing in the service corridor, as though she didn't dare sit down for a full meal in case she needed to leave quickly. He had grown up around people who moved through the world this way. He knew exactly what it meant, and exactly what had made it necessary. On a Thursday afternoon, Declan was passing through the hallway adjacent to the laundry corridor when he heard a voice through the open service door that made him stop walking. A senior housekeeper named Doyle, a woman in her 50s with the clipped efficiency of someone who had confused authority with cruelty for long enough that she no longer noticed the difference, had Nora backed against the far wall, a folding table between them, her voice carrying the particular tone of a person who had decided that someone unable to fight back was a safe target. "You're not here to rest, love. I don't care how far along you are. If you can't keep pace, we'll find someone who can. There are 50 women at the agency who'd be grateful for your spot. I'm keeping up." Nora's voice was barely above a whisper. "You missed 2 baseboards in the East Hall. That's not keeping up. That's dead weight. And let me be honest with you. Pregnancy doesn't earn you special treatment. Not here. Not in any decent house. I'll go back and redo them. You'll do them right the first time, or you'll be out by Friday. Declan stepped through the doorway. Doyle turned. The color left her face in a single, efficient movement. Her hands dropped to her sides, and her whole body rearranged itself into the posture of someone who had just understood the precise nature of the mistake they'd made. "Mrs. Doyle," Declan said. His voice was entirely even. "My office. 10 minutes." He looked at Nora. She was staring at the floor, her hands gripping the edge of the folding table so hard her knuckles had gone white. She had the look of someone bracing for impact, someone so accustomed to situations escalating that the arrival of another person into a bad moment registered automatically as a new threat rather than a relief. "You're fine," he said to her quietly. "Go sit somewhere. Get something to eat." She looked up at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not quite relief, not quite trust, something more tentative and more painful than either. Then she nodded, picked up her cloth, and left. The conversation with Doyle lasted 4 minutes. Declan explained, in the same measured tone he used for all consequential decisions, that anyone employed in his household who treated a pregnant woman with deliberate cruelty would not remain employed in his household. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. By end of day, Doyle had collected her personal items in a paper bag and left the property with a reference letter that was accurate and entirely unenthusiastic. That evening, Nora appeared in the library doorway. She stood at the threshold with one hand on the frame, not quite in the room, not quite willing to commit to entering. The posture of someone who had learned that most situations had exits and that knowing where they were was not paranoia, but survival. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did. She was just doing her job. She was doing something else entirely." He closed the book on his lap. "Come sit with me for a minute." She hesitated. Then she came in. She sat in the leather chair across from him, folding herself into it carefully, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, back still not quite touching the chair's back. The firelight caught the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been earned by age alone. "When is the baby due?" he asked. 6 weeks. Maybe 7. "Are you seeing a doctor?" She looked away. "I've been to a clinic twice." "Twice in how many months?" A pause. 7. He kept his voice neutral. 2 prenatal appointments in 7 months. "I've been busy." "You've been surviving," he said. "There's a difference." She didn't argue. She looked at her hands in her lap and said nothing. And the silence between them settled in the way silences settle between people who once knew each other well enough that words were never the only language. "Do you remember the fence?" he asked. She almost smiled. It was the first time he'd seen anything approaching one. "The one behind the laundromat. You didn't fall off it. You jumped. Eddie Marconi had your backpack and was throwing it over the top. Someone had to do something. You cleared the fence, landed on your face, blood going everywhere, and you still came up with the backpack. I remember being extremely calm about it. You were not calm. I was crying. You were not crying. Nora, you could see the bone. You were holding my hand, telling me to stay awake like I was in a war film. Despite herself, unmistakably, completely against her will, she laughed. It was small and brief, but it was fully real, and it changed the quality of the air in the room in a way that was difficult to explain and impossible to miss. Declan leaned back. You were the only person on that block who ever stood up for me. Not once. Every time. Eddie and those guys and their commentary about my shoes, my clothes, my mother. Every time someone pushed me on the way home. You were always there. A kid with a backpack bigger than she was, stepping in front of people twice her size. Somebody had to. Nobody had to. That's the point. Nobody had to, and you did anyway. Every single time. Her eyes glistened. She blinked it away fast, with the practiced speed of someone who had learned that tears were something to be concealed rather than allowed. That was a long time ago, she said. Not to me. She stared at her hands. Declan, I'm not who I was. A great deal has happened. I can see that. I don't want your pity. You're not getting pity. You're getting honesty. He paused. Someone hurt you, and you're afraid. I can see it every time you walk into a room. You check the exits before you check the people. You keep your back to the wall. You flinch at doors. I know what that looks like, Nora. I grew up around it. A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away fast, almost angry at herself for it. The fire cracked softly in the grate. The wind moved through the garden outside. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, and in that silence, something shifted between them. Not toward anything defined or named, but away from the careful distance she had been maintaining since the day she walked into this house. His name is Garrett, she said at last. Her voice had gone thin and deliberate, the voice of someone narrating their own pain from the far side of a wall they'd built specifically for this purpose. We were together for 2 years. I met him in Pennsylvania, at a restaurant where I was waitressing. At first he was the kindest man I'd ever known, and she began to tell him. She told it carefully, the way a person tells a story they have rehearsed in their own mind many times but never said aloud. Each sentence measured, each detail chosen, as though she were testifying rather than confiding. Garrett had been patient, generous, attentive in the way that, she now understood, was not love but reconnaissance. He remembered everything she told him. Her preferences, her fears, her history, the small vulnerabilities she shared in the early months of intimacy, and she had believed that remembering meant caring. She understood now that it meant something different. It meant cataloging. When she got pregnant, the change was gradual enough to be deniable. First, questions about where she was going and who she was with. Natural, she told herself. He was worried about her. He loved her. He just needed reassurance. Then the phone inspections, every text, every search history, every call log reviewed before bed each night, conducted with a thoroughness that he framed as concern and she absorbed as obligation. Then the rules, small at first, and then less small, about what she wore and who she spoke to, and how quickly she was expected to respond to his messages. And then, one evening when she said something wrong, she no longer remembered what, only that it had been small and ordinary and entirely insufficient as a reason. He grabbed her wrist. I stood there for what felt like a very long time, she said, trying to understand what had just happened. Because it didn't compute. The man who had held my hand in the hospital when I was sick, who had driven 4 hours to be with me when I was scared, who had told me that no one would ever hurt me as long as he was there. That man had just grabbed my wrist hard enough that I could feel it the next morning. He apologized. He cried. He held her and told her it would never happen again, and she believed him, because the alternative, that the man whose child she was carrying was not going to change, had never intended to change, was simply the person he had always been, was not something she could allow herself to believe and still get through the day. It happened again, Declan said. It wasn't a question. It happened again. Her voice was perfectly flat, different each time, and always the same. A shove into a wall. His hand around my throat once, just for a few seconds, and then he let go, and he looked frightened of himself, and I actually thought that meant something. That his being frightened meant he would stop. She pressed her lips together. It didn't mean that. Declan's hands were still on the arms of the chair. His face was composed and even, but something behind his eyes had locked into place, something old and patient and very, very cold, and it had been there since the word throat. 5 months ago, she said, he left for work early. I had 40 minutes. I took one bag, clothes, my ID, the cash I'd been hiding in the lining of an old coat, because he went through everything else. I drove for 9 hours with no destination. I ended up here. 2 nights in my car, then a shelter, then the agency listing. Does he know where you are? I changed my name. Prepaid phone. No social media. No contact with anyone from before. Not cousins, not friends, no one. Is he looking? The fire hissed softly. Outside, a branch moved against the window glass with a sound like a fingernail. Garrett doesn't let things go, she said quietly. He told me once, very calmly, the way he said things when he wanted them to stay, that if I ever left, he would find me. He said it was a promise. Declan was quiet for a moment. Then, okay. Okay, what? Okay. I heard you. She looked at him with an expression caught somewhere between fear and confusion. Declan, you can't get involved. You don't understand what he's like. He doesn't care about consequences. He's not. I understand exactly what he's like. This isn't your problem. You're right, he said. It's not a problem. A pause. Not anymore. He said it the way someone states a fact about the weather. No performance. No bravado. Just a quiet, absolute certainty that settled over the room like a change in air pressure. Nora opened her mouth and closed it again. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since she had walked into this house. She saw the boy from Hester Street. Older, harder, carrying the weight of a world she only partially understood. But underneath all of it, the same eyes. The same stubborn, unshakable steadiness that had once walked her home every night through a neighborhood where walking alone after dark was a gamble nobody won consistently. She didn't say thank you. The word wasn't proportionate. She nodded once. He nodded back. The following morning, Declan made 2 calls before 7 o'clock. The first was to Dr. Amara Osei, an obstetrician at a private practice on the north side, who owed him a significant favor and whose discretion was the kind that didn't require reminders. He explained the situation in broad terms and arranged for Nora to be seen within the week. A full prenatal evaluation, blood work, ultrasound, nutritional assessment. Everything that should have happened over the past 7 months and hadn't, because she had been too busy surviving to attend to the business of being taken care of. The second call was to a man named Fenn, who handled research of the kind that didn't appear in any official database, and who asked questions only when the answers would affect his methodology. Declan gave him a name, Garrett Voss, Pennsylvania, 2 years prior, and a physical description, and told him he needed everything within 48 hours. He didn't tell Nora about either call. When she arrived for her morning shift, he intercepted her before she reached the cleaning station and told her she had a medical appointment on Friday. She stared at him. I didn't ask for that. No, I arranged it. Declan, 7 months along with 2 prenatal appointments is not a debate I'm willing to have, he said. Dr. Osei is thorough, discreet, and excellent. The car will be out front at 10. She stood in the corridor looking at him with the expression she often wore when he did something she didn't know how to refuse and didn't quite trust enough to accept, a complicated mixture of wariness and something underneath it that was too cautious to call relief, but was moving in that direction. You're very used to people doing what you say, she said. In my experience, it saves time. That must be convenient. Occasionally. Mostly it's just efficient. He paused. Are you eating breakfast? I was going to come to the kitchen. She followed him with the slightly resigned air of someone who had decided that this particular hill was not worth defending. Mrs. Keene, who had worked for Declan for 11 years and had learned to be unsurprised by most things, produced eggs and toast and tea without being asked and delivered them to the small table in the alcove off the main kitchen with a smooth, unobtrusive efficiency that made her invaluable. Nora ate. Declan sat across from her with a coffee and watched her in the same way he watched everything, without appearing to watch at all. You're staring, she said. I'm thinking. About what? About the fact that you drove 9 hours with 1 bag and no plan and ended up at my house, he said. Of all the agency listings in this city. She looked at him over the rim of her mug. I didn't know it was yours. I didn't know your name until my 3rd day here, when one of the other staff mentioned it. What did you do when you found out? A beat. I nearly quit. Why didn't you? She set the mug down. Because I had $40 left, and the shelter had a 3-week wait list, and I was 7 months pregnant. A pause. And because by the time I found out, you'd already moved me off the overnight shift, which I'd specifically requested to avoid being seen. Her eyes met his briefly. I figured maybe that was enough of a reason to stay. He nodded. The kitchen was warm, and outside the October garden was all bare branches against a low gray sky, and between them the silence was the old kind, the kind that had been built before either of them had language for it, and had simply waited. Friday, he said. 10 o'clock. Friday, she said. 10 o'clock. She picked up her fork, and for the first time since she had arrived in this house, she ate a full meal sitting down. Fenn's report arrived 41 hours after the call, delivered in the format Declan preferred. Clean, direct, no unnecessary framing. Garrett Voss, 34 years old. 2 prior domestic disturbance calls in Allegheny County, both withdrawn before prosecution. A pattern Declan recognized immediately as the particular arithmetic of a woman who had been convinced that calling the police would make things worse and had turned out, at least twice, to be right. One restraining order application also withdrawn. A network of contacts that included, at its outer edges, two men whose names Declan knew from contacts that had nothing to do with domestic addresses in Pennsylvania. He read the report twice. Then he sat for a long time in the library looking out at the garden. He was not a man who engaged in self-examination as a general practice. The examined life was a luxury that the life he'd built did not readily accommodate. But sitting in the firelight with Finn's report on the table and Nora's face in his mind, the way she braced against the folding table, the way she checked the exits, the way she had wiped that tear away with something close to fury at herself for shedding it, he was aware of something he did not often permit himself to feel. Accountability. The specific, uncomfortable recognition that the capacity to make this right existed, and that its existence made inaction a choice rather than a circumstance. He made a third call to a man named Tully who operated in Allegheny County and who had, over the years, resolved a number of situations that official channels were poorly equipped to handle. The conversation was short and specific. He was clear about what he wanted, not violence, not the performance of consequence that his world sometimes defaulted to, but something more durable. A message, delivered through channels that Garrett Voss would understand without ambiguity, that Nora was no longer findable, that looking would be expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money, and that the promise he had made her was now void. He also arranged something else, something that took longer and required a different kind of call entirely, to a solicitor in a different part of the city who handled matters related to housing and documentation. He didn't tell Nora about any of it. She came to the library that evening, as she had fallen into the habit of doing, not invited exactly, but not discouraged, arriving at the end of her shift and sitting in the chair across from him with her hands on her belly and the look of someone who had decided incrementally and against her better judgment that this was a place where she could briefly stop bracing. Dr. Osei called, she said. Good. She was very thorough. A pause. She said everything looks fine. The baby is healthy. She stopped. Swallowed. Started again. She said everything is fine. Good. He said again more quietly. Nora looked at the fire. She also told me that I needed to stop being on my feet for extended periods and that I needed to be eating more protein and that my iron was low. A beat. She was quite direct about the protein. I'll tell Mrs. Keene. Nora looked at him. Declan. What you've done, the doctor, the shift change, what you said to Doyle. I don't know how to. She stopped again. I'm not good at this. I've been not good at this for a long time. Accepting help. Trusting that it doesn't have a cost attached. It doesn't. Everything has a cost. Not this. She was quiet for a moment. The fire settled in the grate with a low, soft sound. Why? She asked at last. Not challenging, genuinely asking, the way a person asks when they need to understand something in order to believe it. He considered the question the way he considered most things, directly, without ornamentation. Because you jumped off a fence when you were 9 years old to get back something that belonged to me, he said. And I've been carrying that for 17 years. She looked at him for a long time. And then she did something she had been very carefully not doing since she arrived in this house. She let her back touch the chair. Just that. Just the small, unremarkable act of leaning back. But in the context of everything, it was everything. The baby came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks earlier than Dr. Osei's most conservative estimate. Nora's water broke at 5 in the morning, while she was in the small guest apartment Declan had quietly arranged for her in the East Wing 6 days prior. A conversion that had been accomplished overnight by a facilities team who'd been told only that a room was needed, not for whom. She had accepted it without the argument he'd been expecting, which told him more about how tired she was than anything she could have said directly. He drove her himself. She was calm in the car in the particular way that people are calm when they have used up their reserve of panic on situations that turn out not to require it, and now found themselves facing something real with whatever was left. She sat in the passenger seat with one hand on her belly and stared through the windshield at the pre-dawn city moving past outside. The empty streets, the early orange of streetlights against a lightning sky, Chicago at the hour when it briefly forgets what it is and becomes something quieter. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know." He stayed. 12 hours later, Nora Callahan held a 7-pound, 2-ounce girl with a full head of dark hair and the focused, slightly indignant expression of someone who had arrived somewhere and had opinions about the temperature. Declan stood in the doorway of the room. He was not a man accustomed to doorways. He was accustomed to rooms, to occupying space fully, to the particular authority of physical presence that he had spent years cultivating. But this room felt like someone else's territory, and he waited in the threshold. Nora looked up and saw him there. She had been crying, was still crying, quietly, the kind of crying that is not grief, but its opposite, the release of something that has been held too long under too much pressure. She didn't wipe it away this time. "Come in," she said. He crossed the room and stood at the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who looked back at him with the unfocused but somehow penetrating gaze of the very newly arrived. "What's her name?" he asked. Nora looked down at the small face against her chest. "Iris," she said. "Iris Hester Callahan." A beat. After the street. Something moved across Declan's face, brief, genuine, the kind of expression he rarely permitted in any room. "Hester," he said. It seemed right. She adjusted the baby gently. "That's where she started, in a way. That's where we both did." She looked up at him. "That's where you were kind to me before you knew what it would ever cost you." He pulled the chair from the corner of the room and set it beside the bed and sat down. Outside, the city was going about its day in the ordinary, relentless way cities do, indifferent to the particular rooms and particular moments that will, for the people inside them, mark the before and the after. Inside, it was very quiet. The baby made small, definitive sounds. Nora's breathing gradually slowed. 3 days later, Finn confirmed that Garrett Voss had received his message and understood it completely. He had, as of that morning, removed the secondary phone he'd been using to track Nora's general location and had ceased his inquiries through mutual contacts. He would not stop permanently out of virtue. Declan had no illusions about that. He would stop permanently because stopping was now, clearly and without ambiguity, the only available option. Nora didn't ask what had been done. She asked once, 2 weeks after coming home. Home to the East Wing apartment that had become, without formal announcement, simply where she and Iris lived, and he told her only that it was handled, and she looked at him for a long moment, and then said, "Okay." In the same tone he had used with her the night she told him Garrett's name. Because some things don't require the details to be trusted. They only require the person delivering them to have already proven, in small ways over many ordinary days, that they are worth believing. Nora Callahan had spent years making herself invisible. She had perfected the particular art of disappearing in plain sight. Long sleeves, lowered eyes, footsteps calibrated not to be heard, a self reduced to its smallest possible outline in the hope that a smaller target was a safer one. She had arrived in Declan Brennan's house as nobody, a name on an agency list, a woman in a dark uniform, just careful enough and quiet enough to go entirely unnoticed. Except that she had a scar above her left eyebrow that she'd earned at 9 years old jumping off a fence for someone who needed her to, and a man whose house she had walked in had been standing 3 feet away that day and had never forgotten it. The world Nora had come from told her that being known was dangerous, that visibility was risk, that the safest version of herself was the invisible one. What she found in a library by a fire in October was that the oldest, truest version of being known by someone who had seen you before you learned to hide, was not dangerous at all. It was the only thing that had ever made her safe. Iris Hester Callahan was 4 weeks old and already had opinions about everything. And in the Brennan estate, in a room that was now genuinely theirs, her mother was finally, fully, quietly, without apology, present. If this story reached you, please share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. Hit like if you made it to the end. And tell me in the comments, when did you realize he'd known who she was all along? I'll see you in the next story.